Welcome to another presentation of Capital Economics. Today we're going to be discussing U.S. unemployment and asking the question, have we bottomed out, at least graphically speaking? That is to say, have we reached peak employment? Currently we are sitting at 3.7%, which is a multi-decade low, and if you're paying attention to the financial mainstream news, if you're paying to the political going-ons, if you're paying attention to Donald Trump's Twitter feed, you know that this is a multi-decade low. What we are interested today in examining is what type of information can we glean from this report, from the jobs number, from the unemployment figure, as to where we sit in relation to the business cycle. Because the word recession has been thrown around quite frequently, because we are in the midst of the longest expansion in U.S. history since we have been keeping records. So we are saying, well, are we sort of long in the tooth here? Are we going to be near a turning point? There are some market analysts and even some economists out there who are stating that we are currently in a recession or that we're going to be in one here very shortly. We are simply going to look at some of the vital statistics in making that decision and that determination. While the unemployment figure is clearly telling us what had already taken place the month prior, we are going to ask the question, can we look at the current level and can we extrapolate information from this to say, where are we in the business cycle, and can we use that to predict when we will be in a recession? So that is the topic of today's presentation. Now, before we move on, some basic groundwork that we have to pay attention to, because the word recession comes around all the time, right? What does it mean? If you are listening to the mainstream media, the financial mainstream media, what you are likely to hear are two consecutive negative quarters of GDP growth. Okay, so back-to-back negative reports when talking about GDP. However, it is not Wall Street, it is not politicians, it is not Washington, D.C. that makes the determination or the call for a recession. That is determined by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. So what is their definition? A recession is a period of falling economic activity spread across the economy lasting more than a few months, normally visible in real GDP, real income, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales. The trough marks the end of the declining phase and the start of the rising phase of the business cycle. Economic activity is typically below normal in the early stages of an expansion, and it sometimes remains so well into the expansion. So this is just laying the groundwork as to the determination and what the actual definition of a recession is. Okay? It's peak to trough. What do the economists within the National Bureau of Economic Research, what figures are they looking at to make this determination? Now, clearly, GDP is one of them, and it is an important figure, but it is not the only metric that they look at to make this determination. Again, it's real GDP, it's real income, it's employment figures, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales. Okay? So with that in mind, let's continue with some of our graphical presentation here. So the other thing before we get kick-started here with this graph and a few others that we make our way, it is also important to understand that the economists in the committee within the National Bureau of Economic Research do not call a recession the very month in which it takes place. It takes months, if not a year, before the committee makes its determination as to when the economy hit its peak and when it hit its subsequent trough. The reason why it takes the committee so long is because they are waiting for economic data to be published from the respective private institutions and government institutions. Some of this data is produced monthly, some of it is produced quarterly. And if you follow our podcast, The Capital News, you know, or if you're just aware of these reports, that there are multiple revisions to all of these figures. So it literally takes months in and of itself for the final readings to be disclosed to the public, and thus the NBER as well. Then these economists are going to have to make their determination, their analysis, which in and of itself could take a while. So we will be in a recession before the recession is called. This is nothing new. This is not breaking news. This is just laying the groundwork for what we are going to be discussing here in the future. So, as we look at this graph in front of us now, we are looking at the civilian unemployment rate, sometimes referred to as U3. This is the headline figure that the mainstream media, the financial mainstream media, is going to devote basically an entire day to if there's nothing else going on. This is what the President of the United States, current administrations, prior administrations, will refer to when they're talking about unemployment. This is what politicians will refer to when they're talking about unemployment. They will use this figure, the politicians, to their advantage one way or the other. If it is a good number, the parties in power will claim victory because their policies are working. If it's a poor number, then the opposition is going to say, look, we need a change of guard. Their policies aren't working. We need to get back into power. So this is the political game that goes back and forth. I'm sure many of you are aware of this. What we want to do is cut through all of the noise, cut through all of the politics, cut through all of the tweets, and simply look at the data. And that's what we're going to do here during this presentation. So currently, we are sitting at 3.7%, our current unemployment figure. This report just came out last Friday, so this is up to date as we can be, which is what we're trying to do here at the Capital News podcast and at the Capital News presentations and Capital Economics presentations. So, as you can look, we have quite a bit of data, which is good. We want a good sample size. We want to see if we can extrapolate something, if any of this data, if any of this graph is meaningful as we make our way through this business cycle, which we're always making our way through the business cycle. It's just a question as to where are we in the business cycle? Is it expansionary? Have we peaked? Are we going down? Have we troughed out? What is the question, right? So, one of the things that we constantly hear, especially from this current administration, is that President Donald Trump and his administration are the jobs administration. He is the jobs president. Well, among very clear indication here, we drew a trend line from the bottom, if you will, of unemployment, reaching 10% during the height of the Great Recession back in 2009. This trend line is very consistent with unemployment continuing trend. There is no great deviation in this trend line, none whatsoever. You can tell by the slope of the line. So while you have different personalities, clearly, between President Obama and President Trump, this is true of any president. Everybody, we're all different. Everybody has a different personality, a different take. However, you didn't have President Obama taking to Twitter every jobs report and just tweeting jobs, jobs, jobs. So you just have a different personality and different tactics and strategy as to how that news gets out into the public. But this is simply a continuation of jobs growth. Plain and simple. There is no great drop-off as to, and there's right about this point right here is when Donald Trump was sworn in as President of the United States. There is no great drop-off, although there is slightly, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. This is virtually a continuation of trend. You have a steep drop-off here during the Obama administration. A lot of jobs were created during the Obama administration. A lot of jobs continue to be created under the Trump administration. Again, this is the business cycle. It doesn't make any difference greatly who is sitting in the Oval Office. This is a continuation of trend. It is highly evident. Now, what the administration currently tells us is that we are sitting at multi-decade lows on the unemployment figure. This is true. There is no question about this, and this is why we drew this orange horizontal line simply to mark where we are today, going back all the way to 1967, 1968 to get back to this 3.7 figure. In fact, during the 1967, 1968 time, we had a low of 3.4%. So that's very true. We are sitting at a multi-decade low in the unemployment figure, again, on U3, the headline figure. Now, what we are going to look at as we make our way through this presentation is when does unemployment peak out or bottom out, and how long until a recession is called? When is that determination? So as you can see here, going back all the way to the 1940s, 1950s, you can see here unemployment bottoms out and boom, in a recession. move forward, unemployment bottoms out, graphically speaking, as you will. Boom, you're in a recession. You make your way through, you can see this graphically. Now, as we've made our way through the decades, there's a little bit more of a gap between when unemployment bottoms out and when we are actually in a recession, so when we actually hit the peak of the expansion, as you can see from the 1980s, 1990s, most recently with the great financial crisis. All of these points, unemployment bottoms out, and then you have the peak, and now you start the recession. That's the business cycle. That's what we're talking about here. So we're going to make our way through looking at some other data points. So here, if you follow the Capital News podcast, we talk not only about the U3 figure, but the U6. This is the broadest measure, and that's defined as total unemployed plus all marginally attached workers plus total employed part-time for economic reasons. Now, that's a mouthful. It's easier just to say U6. This is the broadest measure that is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So, if you're an individual who would like to have a full-time job, but you can't find one, again, for economic reasons, you will be counted in the U6 figure. Now, you are marginally attached if you are still looking for work but have been unemployed for a year or less. If you are a discouraged worker, remain unemployed, but are no longer looking for work, and it's been longer than a year, the government no longer counts you as unemployed. Even though you are unemployed, you are of working age, you are capable of working, you will not be picked up in this U6 number. You're not going to be picked up in any number that the government creates and distributes. But to me, this is the number you want to gauge because this is the broadest measure. And as you can see, this is also a continuation of trend when we put this trend line in here. I mean, we were talking 16, 17% on this number during the height of the great financial crisis. And we have, again, just like we saw in the last graph with U3, this is simply a continuation of trend. Again, this is the business cycle doing its thing. We are in expansion, jobs are being created. The question that we are asking here during this presentation, has unemployment bottomed out, graphically speaking? Right now, with U6, we are at 7%. This is the lowest it has been during this expansionary phase. And again, this is the longest expansionary phase in U.S. history since we've been keeping records. So 7%. So the same thing, we draw another horizontal orange line here to say, well, when was it last 7%? And it has not been this low since the 2000s, 2000, 2001, right in this period here. So, indicative of the same thing, what we're looking at U3, multi-decade lows. Here, we have to go back to 1999, 2000 to get back to our 7% figure. Can this continue on this downward trend? Of course it could. But the question here is, has it bottomed? And if it has bottomed, what does that mean? Now, another metric we're going to look at, again, is another broad metric, but it's also very important to pay attention to, and this does not get that much attention in the media, is the civilian labor force participation rate. Currently, we are sitting at 63%. Now, as you can tell, graphically speaking, this is a low point, and we have not been at 63% or 62% because we've been fluctuating. As you can see, we've been range-bound here for quite a while, and since the great financial crisis, we've been downtrending and sort of range-bound for quite a while, for the past decade. Now here, ladies and gentlemen, 63% being a low number is not good. It's good to have a low figure on the U6 and on the U3, which we have seen, and on the U3, it's been a multi-decade low. In relation to the civilian labor force participation rate, it has also been and is a multi-decade low, as again is evidenced here by our orange horizontal line. We have to go all the way back to the late 1970s to get back to this level. And on the participation rate, again, lower is not better. So, what can we attribute this to? If you look at this graph here, I attribute a lot of this to demographics. You have the baby boom generation really picking up, taking stride, right? They're graduating college, they're entering the workforce, they're getting married, they're buying homes, they're starting their careers, and as they make their way through this time, they're moving up the corporate ladder, getting improvements, making more money. Families are expanding, they're hitting peak spending, and then you take into consideration all of the debt that has been placed on the system at the government level, at the household level, the personal level, and at the corporate level, and then you understand that debt is simply bringing future demand and future growth forward to today. All of that needs to be paid off. All of that needs to be paid off. And that is what we are witnessing. That is what we have been witnessing. And that is what we will most likely continue to witness because we have continued with those same policies of credit and debt expansion. Well, the piper needs paid, as I like to say on our Capital News podcast. So a lot of this, I believe, is attributable to demographics. The baby boom generation brought all of this growth during their prime years. Now it needs to be paid off. Now they are entering retirement. Now most of them, unfortunately, do not have adequate savings for their retirement. And so, also being in the midst of the great financial crisis, this did structural damage to the economy. It is just a whole bunch of things coming together at once. You also have the next generation, the millennials, who are riddled with a whole bunch of student debt. So that is also slowing down growth. You also have automation that is displacing workers. So you have a number of things coming together at the same time, which to me explains why we have the civilian labor force participation rate at multi-decade lows. So when we go back to those other graphs, we're seeing some sort of a mixed signal here. We have multi-decade lows on unemployment, but we also have multi-decade lows on the participation rate. If you have a vibrant and robust economy, more people should be participating. That's not what we're seeing, as is evidenced by this low figure of 63%. Now, the primary gist of this presentation is to get an analysis as to when a peak, a turning point, is likely to be called. So what we did here is we simply looked at the data of those previous graphs in relation to the U3 and U6 figures. We also looked at the National Bureau of Economic Research. We looked at their dates as to when a recession is called. And real quickly here, let's go back a couple just to explain to you. When you're looking here at the U3 number, and we have all of these shaded regions here, right? These are the recessions. These are the recessions. So this is the great financial recession here, this great area. And as you can tell, the width of these lines, these recessions, differ. This is simply the duration. Again, this is not Wall Street's number. This is not the federal government's number. These aren't politicians' numbers. These are the numbers and the dates that are determined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And that's how we put this data together. That's how the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they recognize NBER's dates. FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data, they recognize the NBER as the final say. So just so you understand what those vertical lines are, that's representing the recession. So when we go to this table here, and we look at the recessions and we look at the dates that are called, here in the recession table we have our first recession, December of 1969. This here is the peak. That was determined by the NBER. They also determined that the trough was in November of 1970. Okay, so just so you understand what you're looking at here. Now, what I did is I went back and I looked at the actual numbers that comprise those graphs. For U3, in September of 1968, we hit a low on the unemployment rate of 3.4%. Okay? It took 3 months for the economy to hit its peak. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, of course, NBER did not call a recession in December of 1969. It took them months after to figure out that we were in recession. Okay? But nevertheless, we have the ability of hindsight here of looking at this data to say, look, in September of 1968, U3 hit 3.4%, and the expansion peaked out only 3 months later. And we do this throughout the entirety of the several recessions that we have data for. So when you're looking at the 1973 recession, the peak was called in November. However, unemployment peaked out or bottomed out, graphically speaking, at 4.6% in October, 1 month prior. And we make our way down. 1980, we have a low of 5.6% that was hit in May of 1979. It took 8 months. The expansion continued for 8 months until we hit our peak. Back-to-back recessions, we had one in 1981. We had unemployment hit its low of 7.2%. It then took 7 months until the peak was called. So 7 months more of an expansion. The 1990 recession, we hit low unemployment at 5% in March of 1989. It took 16 months. There was a continuation of 16 months of the expansion before the peak was called. The recession in 2001, we had unemployment bottom out at 3.8%. It took 11 months until the peak was called. Lastly, the Great Financial Crisis. We had a low of 4.4% in October of 2006. It wasn't another 14 months until the peak was called. And then clearly you could look and do the same analysis in regards to the U6 figures. For the data that we have, and the two recessions that were affected here were the 2001 recession and the Great Financial Crisis. Now, where are we today? Are we in a recession? It's up to you. But we're looking at this data point. We believe this is a very important piece of the economic puzzle that is going to paint a vivid picture. Clearly, this is one of the things that the National Bureau of Economic Research also takes into consideration when making their determination. Are we in expansion? Are we in recession? All that jazz, right? Which we were just talking about. So today, if we were to say, all right, look, what's the U3 figure? Well, have we bottomed out at our recent low of 3.6%? Remember, today, currently in July, we're at 3.7. We hit a low of 3.6 to the first decimal point back in April of 2019. We also had 3.6 in May as well, but this was the first point back in April of this year. Okay, now, if you simply take the average of these months and you can do the median of these months, you're basically coming up with the same number, about 8.5 to 9 months. That's your average. But we also have a range of 1 month to 16 months. So, if we're to say that history not necessarily repeats, but that history rhymes, and that is our broad distribution, then we can say, okay, perhaps the expansion peaked out as quickly as May of this year, or it might not peak out until August of 2020, simply using history as our guide, our range of 1 month to 16 months. This is no hard and fast rule. It could be a lot longer. Or we could actually be in a recession right now. That is what the data would tell us. That's the range, simply looking at that. I'm not making the call right now because simply looking at unemployment is not enough. Once we do other presentations, once we look at the yield curve, once we look at the federal funds rate, once we look at GDP, then I will give you my analysis as to when we are likely actually going to be in there, hitting a recession. But for the time being, just looking at this analysis, May of 2019 could have been the peak, or maybe not until August of 2020. Now, if we conduct the same analysis looking at the U6 figure, we come up with another period, because we just hit our low of U6, which we were saying is now 7.0%. That is the most recent number in July of 2019. Now, if we just simply look at our last 2 months, we have a range of 5 months to 12 months. That would put us in December of 2019 for there to be a peak called, or all the way out to July of 2020. Now, as you can see here, the difference between U3 and U6 remains consistent during these last two recessions, and quite possibly the last three if we're in one or are going to be in one, because recessions have not been outlawed. So you have the U6 number that lags the U3. So we had the U3 bottom out in April of 2000. The U6 didn't bottom out until October of that year, and you can see the same thing for the Great Recession and perhaps this next one. Bottomed out in April. Now we currently perhaps bottomed out in July. So that gives us this date range. They start to overlap in December of 2019, and then they continue until July of 2020 of next year. And of course, we are in the midst of a presidential election as well. So everything is going to be quite fascinating to see what takes place. And again, this is only one figure, but it's an important one to pay attention to. Again, if you look at the median and average length between bottoming out and peaking out on the expansion, you're talking about 8.5 to 9 months. So look at it like this as a way to remember it. unemployment gives birth to a recession because it's 9 months, okay? 9 months, unemployment gives birth to a recession. Just looking at the average of the numbers given the past history of these recessions. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there, and we're going to continue with these presentations because I think they're very important. These are the vital statistics that are going to paint a very vivid picture of the economic puzzle that we are putting together. These are the vital statistics that the National Bureau of Economic Research is looking at to make its determination of the business cycle. So continue to follow us, like, share, subscribe. It helps the channel. We truly appreciate it. You can check us out on thecapitalnews.com. You can find us on YouTube at The Capital News. You can also check out our podcast on Apple Podcasts and also find us on Twitter. If you'd like to add to your library, which is always a great thing, we need more readers out there, you can check out our book, The Cynic's Guide to Investing. In the era of too big to fail, it pays to be a cynic. Understanding the economy, understanding how it operates, understanding the sectors and the players within the economy, and then taking all of that information and investing prudently and for the long term. This is a book that you want in your arsenal. This is a book that you want in your library. You can find it on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, hardback, paperback, and a Kindle version. Like we like to say, learn the game, know the players, and build your wealth. Thank you so much for joining me. And as we like to say here, stay diversified, stay vigilant, and stay with the Capital News.